was curious in thinking about stances, exactly how to think of them, and I thought a contrast might be helpful with Anil Gupta's view in empiricism and experience, if you're familiar with that. So to sketch it briefly, the view he's developing is he's mainly focused on the content of perceptual experience, and he argues that that content should be taken as having a conditional character. So rather than thinking that perceptual experience just gives us propositional content, he thinks you should think of it as content that's conditional on a view. So for example, if you have a view that you're a brain in a vat, you can have the experiences that we're all having, but the propositional content that those experiences would give you would only concern the internal contents of your own mind. Whereas if you don't have the brain in the vat view, then you get perceptual content, or you get propositional content regarding external objects. Right? So the interesting thing about this position is the actual propositional content differs. So it's really differing views can be very different content. So that's a very radical way in which the view determines what the propositional content is that's available to you. But he also thinks that that should be revised. So the view itself is in some sense can be assessed as you acquire more and more propositional content. And there are some views that are seen as kind of dead end in the sense that you can't revise it, or it's not subject to revision. So the Cartesian skeptic is rejected because it's sort of this dead end view that doesn't update. And there's the technical machinery he's using here is the logic of interdependent definitions. But in any case, the reason I brought this up is that there you have a way of characterizing what a view is that in some sense seems more radical than your account of stances, because it's that the propositional content each person would differ depending on their view. And so the question is what is it that differs with regard to stances? So is it as radical as if you have a certain stance, then I can present you with the same evidence, and in some sense the content of what I should believe is actually different? Or is it something quite a bit weaker, which is Stathis presents us with evidence about the existence of atoms, and then we differ in degree in terms of what evidence is compelling, and then we draw different metaphysical implications based on that evidence. So where does the contrast between different stances fall in that kind of spectrum?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's one sense in which thinking about different propositional contents that we might associate with one and the same sentence, right, or assertion is certainly relevant to thinking about the issues in this book. And I think it really comes in to play when we're talking about what I call deflationary conceptions of ontology. Mm-hmm. So deflationary conceptions of ontology are ones in which the kind of earnest way of approaching ontology, right, which I take to be a traditional and perhaps person in the street type attitude towards what we might be doing in ontology, which is to say, there's a world out there, we're trying to discover facts about the world. Right? To the extent that we're successful, we've managed to describe, right, certain facts about that world. If you were to spell this out in more philosophical terms, then you might think of that in terms of some kind of correspondence or some kind of truth-making or some kind of something, right? There's a world independent of us, and we're learning things about it. Deflationary accounts of ontology are ones that say, look, I might make all of the same pronouncements as you regarding ontology. I might say that certain particles have certain state-independent properties, or I might say that certain proteins have certain bases, or I might make all the same sorts of claims, right? I might assert all the same sorts of sentences, but we should really take the content of that sentence to be elliptical for something else. Right? So there the propositional content really does, I think, differ. You might take the sentence to be, in fact, not something that should be interpreted in the kind of earnest idiom that I described, but as elliptical for a historically situated paradigmatic convention for describing, right, the relevant phenomena. That's a historicist way of approaching it. You might take the relevant propositional contents to be reflective of the kind of linguistic conventions that we adopt, so the things that we can assert within a kind of linguistic framework, but that is to leave questions about whether the earnest idiom, which concerns whether that linguistic framework actually hooks up with the way the world is, right, in the earnest way. That's to leave those questions aside, right? We might adopt these linguistic frameworks for purely pragmatic reasons. So the sentence is elliptical for a set of pragmatic commitments for how we systematize scientific knowledge, right? So that's something you might associate with Carnap. So there are different ways, I think, pragmatic, historicist, right, social constructivist, there are different ways in which you might take the content of the assertion as elliptical for something else. That said, within the domain of people who are adopting this sort of earnest idiom, right, who are operating within the sphere of what I might call, kind of realist approaches to ontology, there, I think, the propositional contents are all the same. And the question before us is understanding the propositional contents in that, basically realist way. Do we then think that we're in a position to assert the truth of that claim or not? And that's where I think people holding different stances of the sort that empiricists and realists of various sorts have fought over, right, may give different answers. The different propositional
doesn't consist of both choices, so the choice to adopt a historicist or deflationary, or
I think it does. So I think
the
deflationary stance is itself a stance, right? It's a stance that is often associated with a kind of impatience with, or unhappiness with, or kind of feeling that we're not really in a position to engage with ontological questions in the earnest way, in part because the traditional analyses of truth and reference, in terms of which we explicate those commitments, are just things that we can't say anything sensible about. We can only talk about those things in pragmatic ways, or historically situated ways, or socially situated ways.
Are all responses to evidence equally rational? And can they be justified on the basis that you have a stance? So think of what we've been doing lately here at Rotman, reading Perren's experiments on Brownian motion, showed that atoms are there, apparently. So everybody was persuaded to change their stance. Ostwald, Arrhenius, Poincaré. It was a rational response, in my view. Duhem didn't. Duhem never actually changed his mind. He took it to his deathbed that atoms are not real. Is it a rational response to the evidence? Or because he had the stance, anti-atomism was a stance, we would justify what he did?
I was curious as well. I mean, there's a sort of related question, which is, are there ways in which stances have to change, or is it, Yeah. So, I mean, then a stance starts to blur a little bit too much into some substantive scientific knowledge. Yeah. So I think I have the wrong view of what a stance is, but how are stances meant to evolve along with, I mean, there'd be one view, which is that the evidence has changed, and now what conclusions you can draw from that are changed just because the evidence, then you might have stances that sort of dictate different sorts of responses to the evidence. A different view would be maybe that the stance itself has been ruled out, that there's a way in which the discovery of atoms has now constrained what could be a reasonable stance about molecular reality.
Yeah. So,
but I might just be confused about what a stance is on your view.
I'm not sure you are, but let me try to give a sense of where I'd want to come down on this. So, would someone, after Perren's experiments, and then in the aftermath of Perren's experiments and the thinking about it that happened, would they be irrational to say that there are no atoms? Well, saying that there are no atoms, or the claim that atoms exist is false, is, I think, a different kind of claim from saying, I suspend belief with respect to the proposition that atoms exist.
Yeah, that's okay.
So I think we can have a really good discussion in any particular case once we've fixed what the evidence is, and once we've fixed what our standards for assessing that evidence are. whether then, right, following that level of statistical significance or following that, particular conception of how we should analyze the data, whether certain conclusions follow from the data. And you would be mistaken if you said they didn't, right? As long as you haven't made any mistakes in your assessment of the evidence. That, I think, is different from saying, would someone be irrational, right, to say, you know what, the evidence is interesting, it's persuasive to an extent, but not such an extent that I can commit to the truth of the proposition. Right? But that's to say that I suspend belief with respect to the truth of the proposition. And that, I think, is something that is very often rational in the minimal sense that I described it, which is that it's internally consistent and coherent. Right? The fact that a lot of people, and perhaps everyone, apart from Duhem and then Duhem died and then everyone, well, we know it isn't everyone, right? Because we have friends who still don't believe in the, who aren't willing to assert the truth of the proposition atoms exist. It isn't really a popularity contest, right? I mean, that's not going to decide whether the particular doxastic state that someone takes in response to this evidence is rational or not. It may be that there are no idealists anymore. Maybe that was a going proposition at one point, and now there are just no one who would pull out their idealism club member card.
Except for people working on quantum information.
But are they people?
Yes.
So
Quantum Bayesians.
Yeah. So it may be that that there are philosophical views that no one holds anymore. But that, I think, is something that we should separate from the question of whether that view might be coherent and internally consistent and coherent. And I think there are cases here where there are ebbs and flows, and I think that's a really interesting feature of the history of philosophy and the history of ideas, that at certain points, and you will know this all too well, Chris, right, there are certain points in the history of physics where people leaned in a more cautious direction and just said, look, since I'm not really sure what this theory is talking about, right, I'm going to suspend my belief with respect to a lot of the ontological questions it's posing. That doesn't mean that I'm any less a scientist, and that doesn't mean that I'm any less committed to exploring this and to doing experiments and to theorizing, right? But I'm more cautious with respect to my ontological commitments. And then there are swings and roundabouts that I think are interesting sociological facts about the kinds of stances that scientists themselves adopt. So I think that, when I talk to, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room have had this experience, you talk to scientists about what their ontological commitments are. And often, especially in cutting edge areas, right, they're very cagey. And so, you may have to buy them a couple of drinks before they'll really start to answer your questions, right? But they're cagey for understandable reasons. But then, what emerges is that you actually find different scientists have different commitments with respect to even one and the same research program, right? Some may be convinced earlier, some may be convinced later. And that's exactly the sort of thing that I think is evidence for the idea that they actually have different stances. And the work that they're doing is actually something that is compatible with having different stances, right? So that's part of what I mean when I say that, science underdetermines its own interpretation, and that scientific ontology is inherently meta-scientific or involves philosophical or metaphysical commitments. There was a time in the history of science when a lot of the leading lights of science were also very philosophically adept. And so they were very good at articulating what their own stances were, and they would. I'm not sure we're in that position right now across the board, right? But that doesn't mean that scientists themselves aren't operating with different stances that they use to interpret their own work in different